Blind Owl and Manifesto. An essay in Manifesto against war in the contemporary age of information entropy. Contributors: Matthew Tudor, Chris Godber, Jamie Stantonian, Becca Sif. There are nights when the wolves are silent and only the moon howls. George Carlin. Introduction. Moloch. The history of war. Tribal cultures, the psychology of dehumanization, politics of terror and control, power in the military-industrial complex, propaganda and protest, information entropy and the submission of human dignity, current political age, alt-right and the fall of dialogue, religious extremism, the re-emergence of nation-states, Brexit, Trump and the return of blood and nation myths in popular culture, political culture, the false king, Donald Trump and the alt-right, artistic responses to the current situation, subversion of power to dilute the spread of the lie, territory and resource, image making, the return of the idol and culture, technological and spiritual responses, psychedelic reinterpretation of power symbols, history of war. War is the applied psychosis of mankind. What is war in this century? It is a tool the strong use against the weak, who are the strong, but the strong do not see. They are the blind owls. They believe their own lie. Neoliberals, hawks, the pundits of a reductive cult of masculine pillars. Penis dream architects you can only build up, never sideways. Incompetent old doddering fools who gladly send their sons and daughters to hell. Power lovers, bankers, administrators as a feeble cult of power, finance and misery. Ignorant one percenters, Ayn Rand readers, sociopathic tendencies, Donald Trump, Tony Blair, dead children, ISIS and the cult of the God machine, dead thinkers, stale. Tribalism. Tribalism is everywhere and marks every aspect of our culture. None are free of it. We in the tunnel are the tribe brave enough to call ourselves that which we are. Artists and thinkers, drunks and degenerates. Victims in another age. They are the blind owls. We are the owls whose eyes do not burn, and for whom our coming brings the dawn of a new age, new day. Liberty, freedom, equality, socialism, and love. But before I veer into such knowingly political language, I must first question myself and confront some rather torrid demons I bear. The apolitical and apathetic bastard within, the chain-smoking man in black, who chain-smokes like there were not a tomorrow. Our tribes. Me. Metal. Artist, atheist, the angry chain-smoking kind. Nihilist, existentialist on a good day. Addict, mentalist, techno-foggot. Anarchist on angry days. Socialist on happier ones. Techno-obsessive, likes the woods. Matt Tudor. A bald man who works in Sainsbury's and paints pictures of his friends. By bald, I mean bald and bold. Becca. Owl. Artist. Interested in the occult. Witch. Took Crowley a bit too seriously. Scary to mums. Good with children. Fine babysitter. That's obviously tongue in cheek. She's a very fine artist. Jamie. Scottish. Bald dad. Dictator of Nod. Brilliant writer. Tolerant thinker. Probably not a statist, I'd imagine. Probably more tolerant of religion than me. Digital artist in the widest sense of the word. And now, on to Matt Tudor's contribution, which is brilliant. I actually need to reread all this again. Our press and our schools cultivate chauvinism, militarism, dogmatism, conformism, and ignorance. The arbitrary power of the government is unlimited and unexampled in history. Freedom of the press, of opinion, of movement is as thoroughly exterminated as though the proclamation of the rights of man had never been seen. Arthur Koestler. The old world is dying and the new one struggles to be born. Antonio Gamsu. The bridge. Through a series of trials and experiments, the bridge rises up out of the primitive jungle supported by the brutal military complex. The idea of the warrior hero is bound to the foundations of every society. A noble savage defending freedom and democracy, but in reality these ideas are meaningless to the common soldier. Their only desire is to be destroyed by a warrior of equal worth. Inevitably, all of the faceless men of this drama play out their tragic comic story at the base of the mighty structure, eventually destroying each other in futile acts of primitive violence and inflicting significant damage to the bridge. However, it remained intact. Culture on Brexit. On the 23rd of June 2016, a moment was reached in the history of the United Kingdom. An attempt by the working classes to resurrect an identity that had its foundations in an old, dying culture. They foolishly engaged in a futile struggle with not only the EU, but a younger generation to reassert the idea of Englishness and empire. A younger generation that had embraced multiculturalism, like so many across Europe, and the idea of a society composed of individuals, rather than an unthinking, subservient, debt-ridden mass. The destructive act of nationalism by an ignorant minority failed to understand that the culture they were trying to resurrect had for decades been destroyed not by immigrants, but by the all-encompassing consumerism that has infected every level of society. Little did they realise this had been possible by the dominance of popular culture, its ability to lobotomise the masses to produce more efficient consumers. Popular culture and the tabloid press had been shaping the consciousness of the working classes for decades. The biggest lie of all was that intellectual freedom was offered by the media, and therein lay their liberation. Social media has created a false consciousness amongst the low-paid and overworked classes, their distractions from their misery and underachievement, a fictionalised reshaping of social relations. This altered consciousness has led to an incredible amount of underachievement by the poorer classes. Their only desire is to escape the poverty trap and ascend to the higher reaches of capital gain. Not realising that this is a false promise of a dream within a dream. So, that is all we've written for the Blind Owl. So next, I'm going to try and think of some possible solutions. Now obviously we could have a technological solution to these problems, and this is already happening with increasing automation of labour, which will become a reality within a decade, whether we like it or not. Living in a post-truth age, it's almost impossible to determine sources of truth online through the tools that we use to disseminate information. This in turn creates a conflict, because if we are, as I described in my artist engineer hypothesis, striving to be creative but also logical at the same time in terms of how we understand the world and making the world a better place, then unless we can determine sources of truth, i.e. objective reality and objective news and information sources, then determining what the actual truth is becomes an almost impossible affair, as it were, to actually determine what the truth is about any given situation in context. Matt's talked about this with the social media there. Social media creates a false consciousness, and it's in a lot of ways is a contradiction, because everybody should have the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is a big issue at the minute in politics, in public life. Should there be limits on that? Should there not be any limits? No platforming is also another big issue, I suppose, in terms of intellectual culture and culture in general. Now, obviously this next part is my personal viewpoint, and it's not really related to the tunnel explicitly, but I am a member of the tunnel and one of the key theorists, so I suppose it is. My view is that information has to be free. It has to be free. The only way that you can have a system that's genuinely based on liberty is to have freedom of the individual. Freedom of the individual only becomes from freedom of thought. That also does mean freedom of responsibility for your own words, and at least making a concerted effort to have those words understood and put in context. Context is key with information. Contextualizing information is the responsibility of every individual, and individuals cultivate themselves through rumination, internalizing aspects of their character, if you want to look at it from a Jungian perspective, internalising all the kind of conflicting parts of yourself, really, from the dark, the shadow, to the ego, to all the rest of it. All these things need to be balanced in the self until they can be balanced also outside, externally, in nature and the world. Now, obviously I'm kind of going into a bit of psychobabble now, but such is my way. But yeah, if man in general, as in like the human race, is to overcome the negative parts of ourselves, then to overcome the negative parts of ourselves we have to bring those parts into conscious awareness and kind of really just cancel them out through the light, I suppose, if I had to put it metaphorically. By which I mean intense dialogues with others who we don't agree with. That is very important. That's incredibly important. Like I mentioned before, I define myself as a pantheist, which means I value nature in the universe over all things. But yeah, sure, I've fallen into nihilist traps before, of destruction and intellectual destruction. I mean, really, not actual physical destruction, but a kind of perverse joy in breaking ideas down to their fundamental levels, which is a good thing if you can reintegrate them into something positive. Where I, and any honest human being, has honestly gone wrong in the past and probably the future too, is not integrating the critiques. Integrating critiques is important in every culture, and the only way that culture actually emerges and becomes something that's actually more useful is by integrating, especially a culture that is predicated on liberty and freedom, is by incorporating critiques and then using those to get better. The problem we have in the world in general now is that we have kind of reverted to very simplistic ideas, and we are increasingly, it seems to me, not engaged in exploring the plurality of different ideas and opinions. And this happens on both the left and the right. On the right, you have the alt-right, who are reverting to kind of nationalistic tropes, to put forth the idea of the nation state as the ultimate ideal, I suppose, which in itself is not. Will lead nowhere, and put into actual implemented in actual society in a kind of deep level will just result in destruction. Fascism, if taken to its logical extreme of the alt-right, would be not something that the human race ever wants to inflict on itself again. But vice versa, on the left we have the kind of emergence of the regressive left, a regressive left that does not tolerate anybody with even a slight alternative to the prescribed notions of truth that emerge in the left. You've touched on identity politics, it can touch on all sorts of things, where one's like basically prescribed identity traits, like for example your racial identity, your national identity, etc., become more important than what you actually bring to the table in terms of your ideas and your will. Now this, obviously I hold my hand up, I'm white and I'm middle class and I'm British, so therefore I've been accorded, because of these things, certain privileges which other people do not have, and I hold my hand up, it's true. But I think as soon as you start hiding behind your identity because you don't have solutions, or you're unwilling to try and explore solutions, I personally think that's a slippery slope. And I think it's killing the left. It's killing the left is this hyper focus on identity as opposed to what it should be about, which is creating an egalitarian society where everybody has potential to actually reach the ultimate aim of what they can be. And let's not I've already written about this for my Zarathustra piece. I critiqued Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a thinker who has influenced me a lot, a hell of a lot. But I also see the flaws inherent in his ideals. And I think everyone who's actually a serious Nietzsche scholar sees this as well. The idea of the overman actually put into practice on a societal level actually does kind of is contradictory, because the whole idea of the overman is someone who's an outsider, and I think it's someone who acts outside of the prescribed moral virtues that are imposed on him or her. And it should be over person, really, technically, I suppose, because overman is just obviously it's assuming masculinity is the driving force in terms of achieving greatness, I suppose, which in itself is flawed. But Nietzsche was a man of his time. He wasn't in the 21st century. He didn't have the emancipation of women. He hadn't been through that, so I can kind of let him off on that. But anyway, essentially, I think the overman idea is flawed because of that very reason. Because what it actually does, and if you read Beyond Good and Evil as well, Nietzsche goes into this. He talks about how his critique of socialism, I think, is kind of flawed in some respects, because it says that he ties that in with Christian morality as well. He kind of groups them together into a critique of Christian morality, where he says that Christian morality is weak because it is, he calls it the last man philosophy, which is the philosophy of he calls it a submission and weakness to a supposed higher power. Now I kind of think there must be a middle ground, and this is where we must search now. I think, like I said, relating it to the Jungian ideas of integration. Integration is actually positive, because it means that you've come to terms with your dark side, and then you've actually, out of all that darkness and horror that exists within all human beings, the nihilism at the core of any human being's deepest, our complex, in the reptilian part of the brain, feed and fuck. That's all that matters to that part of the brain, the old wily snake, as it were. But if you can overcome that, just so that you have to embrace it. Obviously, sometimes you have to ride the old snake, as it were. Riders on the storm and all out of the doors, playing the motor or something. But if you can actually use that as a positive production engine, I suppose, it's actually productive. Now, obviously, I'm kind of going off track now. Blind owls. I think if the human race is to overcome war, and this is a big question, when Matt asked me this question, and everyone in the group, I thought, that's one of the biggest questions you can ask a group of people. How can we not eliminate, but have war be a thing in the past, and have peace be the thing that we reign in? I think what it requires is facing our own demons, facing them full on, facing them in the mirror, facing them outside ourselves and within ourselves. That is the way that war becomes a thing of the past, is by realising, and Jung talks about this again in the Red Book, that every time we engage in this kind of violent thinking, or thinking of violence or against others, and what we're actually doing is killing a part of ourselves. And if we put it in those terms, suicide, killing, are equivalent in some respects. By which I don't mean that people who commit suicide are often very depressed individuals, and I have no time for judging them, and I don't engage in that kind of rhetoric. What I'm saying is, we have to realise that by killing others, or just purely for territorial reasons, is not a path forward. So therefore, I think the real way that we can create a better society is by taking the best of the socialist ideals and ideas, the best of psychoanalysis, and even schizoanalysis, Deleuze and Guattaro, and then combining that with a genuinely progressive ecological, technological framework to bring take those things forward. This does also include an artistic element, the artistic element being created by the artistic engineers, i.e. we need the combination of the logical, which is actual technical implementations of how to make society better, and the artistic, which is responses to how effective those things are. Now, you could probably say that the early Soviet artists did this in some way before they were repressed by Stalin, and I've almost read too much about that to even want to go into the rather bloody, obviously, history of all that. And there is obviously an argument for over socially engineering society, and I completely agree that that is not something that any of us would desire, I think, to have a society where everything is prescribed and socially engineered. The liberty element still needs to be intact, i.e. liberty of the individual. So, I mean, pretty much what I'm advocating for is a democratic form of socialism, I suppose, which needs people to come along with it. You can't just... The whole thing of democratic socialism is you can't enforce it on people. You can't force it from above. It's not like Soviet-style communism or Stalinism, etc., etc. Even Trotskyism, I think, in a lot of ways, is basically kind of deluded in this idea that there will suddenly be a world permanent revolution and everybody will rise up and then suddenly everything will be better. It kind of... That probably would have even involved a lot more deaths, I think, in some respects, because if everybody... Well, yeah, I mean, it's naive, essentially, I think. Trotsky was naive, I think, in his idea of permanent revolution. Revolution, I think... I'm going to quote Bill Hicks now, because, yeah, he's a comedian, but I always someone I take deeply seriously. I think evolution before revolution. The political sphere, that means it does... Yeah, I mean, sure, it means it's a bit slower. There's slower progress, but we've seen from recent history even as well, with the Arab Spring, and when revolutions come from a really, really fast, then what happens? You have foment chaos almost. But I don't know. That's kind of my stream of consciousness on the Blind Owl, which is, as I say, a stream of consciousness. So I might reevaluate parts of it later, but yeah, so food for thought there. And the owls shall awaken, and we all shall howl in the night.